Tonight, we'll be updating you about the Maryland man who was arrested for taping a traffic stop. We'll also be discussing both good news and bad news coming from California, where the governor has decriminalized small amounts of marijuana, and the city of San Francisco is looking to ban McDonald's from placing toys in Happy Meals. We'll also be getting into what the federal government wants to do with street signs on the nation's roadways. That coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome to episode 177 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to consistently think outside the box. It is Toby here with you.
And Nick.
We have some good news to actually report on this episode, Nick. Not one story, but two. Normally it's doom and gloom, bigger bloated governments getting out of control, taking away our freedoms, hacking away at them in huge strides. But we have not one, but two stories that are really good news.
Kind of sad that that's unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, but it makes me happy. We've also got a couple that are more dismal, a little bit more depressing out there, where the government is still growing like a tick sitting on the back of some dog's head, growing bigger and bigger and bigger.
Ticks do get awfully big.
Yeah, they sit there and they leech off the system. But I did want to start off with an update. We've been following this story of a Maryland man who was arrested after filming a police officer who caught him on a traffic stop. A Hartford Circuit Court judge Monday dismissed wiretapping charges against Anthony Graber, a motorcyclist who was jailed briefly after he taped a Maryland State trooper who stopped him for recording for speeding on I-95. Graber used a camera mounted to his helmet and then posted the video on YouTube. That was when he was charged with the wiretapping law, a law that dates back to the 1970s, which was originally intended to protect citizens from government intrusions into their privacy, but which has since been used to make sure that you can't film the police in certain states, or I guess record their audio conversations. Mr. Anthony Graber was facing 16 years behind bars if he was convicted of the charges of wiretapping the police officer, plus a charge that was thrown at him of having a device primarily used for the purpose of surreptitious interception of oral communications. You can have a charge of having a camera mounted to your helmet. Apparently they were trying to make that against the law. The judge threw that out, said almost every cell phone, BlackBerry, and any other similar device, not to mention dictation equipment and other types of recording devices, which should also be illegal if his helmet camera is illegal. The judge also wrote, Judge Emery A. Pitt wrote, "Those of us who are public officials and are entrusted with the public power of the state are ultimately accountable to the public. When we exercise the power in a public fora, we should not expect our actions to be shielded from the public observation. Who watches the watchman?" And man, Judge Emery A. Pitt Jr., you're A-okay in my book. I know you're just a lowly circuit judge, but man, if there were more people like you on the bench, maybe this nation wouldn't be in the toilet.
Yeah, it's a good ruling, and you do get good rulings sometimes. It depends on the judge.
It's not all that often, though, it seems, Nick. I've seen news stories come by all the time of judges hammering down and saying, yes, lock that man up. He recorded a police officer on a public roadway. It's against the law. Even here in New Hampshire, it's against the law. And we've had cases where people have been arrested for it. We've reported on. And it's one of those things that we talk about a lot because it's outrageous. It's insane to think that you can't record a police officer doing their duty in public.
Or on your own property.
Or on your own property.
There have been cases in New Hampshire, at least, where people have been charged for recording police officers on their own property. And it was pretty clear from the recording, which was released, that the police officers knew there was a camera present. It wasn't a hidden camera. So the camera was acknowledged. They just didn't give explicit consent to having this interview, or I guess it was more of an interrogation that was taking place in the home. They didn't give explicit permission to be filmed, but they continued to go through with it, whatever it was that they were doing. So
it's been happening more and more. I see cases all the time popping up where people are arrested simply for filming the police. I say on the job, on the record. They're public officials working in a public forum, working for the public. You should be able to videotape them. If they're actually doing their job, they should have no problem with it. In fact, they should welcome it because it's just more evidence if a crime is actually being committed to use against that person in court. Good cops know this. The cops that aren't dirty, the ones that aren't corrupt know this and enjoy more cameras. The more cameras, the better, because you would be able to use those as evidence against the individual if they're actually committing a crime. If you don't want the camera presence, well, chances are you're not really doing your duty as a police officer. In this particular case, and the video is rolling up there so people can see it, the police officer was undercover cop. Actually, he ran in front, blocked this motorcyclist, Mr. Anthony Grabers. He blocked him, jumped out of his unmarked car, didn't announce himself as a police officer right away, just pulled a gun on him. I mean, right there, it was reason for the police officers to be embarrassed and then arrest him, try to put him in jail for 16 years for recording this. Seems pretty ridiculous. But I'm glad it's been dismissed. It should be noted that Anthony Graber still faces speed charges, so they're still going to take him to court on the speeding. The state can appeal this case, no word if they're going to. If they don't appeal this case, even though it's not going to set a precedent for other judges to follow in other court cases, it is likely to be the last word, at least in Maryland, on the matter, and to be regarded as a precedent by police officers. So the thinking here is, according to the ACLU in Maryland, that unless the state does try to appeal this and get the guy, Mr. Graber, convicted, it's going to be a precedent for the police, although not the courts necessarily.
Right, it's not necessarily.
It's a circuit court.
Right, it's not necessarily going to be established case law, but it'll probably.
But it is good news. It's heartening, Nick, because I've been so depressed reading all these horrible stories about horrible, corrupt judges, horrible, corrupt police officers. I mean, there's so many to report on. It is great to see public officials actually doing the right thing, abiding by the Constitution, and doing their job. It makes me think.
Well, yeah, it's great to see it when it happens, but it's unfortunate that that's become an exception rather than the rule.
That is depressing. But it is still good news. So I'm going to just go with the good news, Nick, and I'm going to be happy about the good news because this man's not going to jail for 16 years. And maybe it'll be a wake-up call for other police officers who don't want to be recorded to stop arresting people for it. Stop trying to put people in jail. People get off for rape and murder for less than this. This guy recorded a police officer in public, and they're trying to put him in jail for more than a rapist or a murderer would get.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a sentence that you would get out of somewhere like Iran or North Korea, not a state in the U.S. Right. where you would serve almost 2 decades in prison for recording a traffic stop.
Not only that, but these laws, the intention of these laws that were put in place in many states in the 1970s were to protect the public from the government.
Right. The idea was that the government officials could just go about
wiretap you. Right. Since then, most
people.
of these laws have been rewritten by other government officials to make the government exempt, so the government can wiretap you. So the entire spirit of the law has been flipped completely upside down.
Well, the spirit and the actual letter of the law.
Right.
They've just completely turned it around so that it doesn't provide the protection for citizens. It only provides the protection for people in government and restrains citizens from really recording public officials. Seems like in public and discharging their duty seems like a right. Supposedly they work for you. Can a boss not keep track of what their employees are doing?
Not if
it's supposed to be that kind of a relationship.
Yeah, but
in theory.
Right, but in theory. But maybe we'll get back to this. More judges like that on the bench. I commend this judge one more time. That judge's name, the good judge, Judge Emeroy A. Pitt Jr. Good job. Anyways, we do need to move on. I want to go with the theme of good news, Nick, coming out of California. Not a lot of good news stories coming out of California all the time. We report on them at least a couple times a month on big government stories, and we'll get into that in the second half of the show, but I want to focus in on the good first, because there is good news with Mr. Schwarzenegger and the most recent signing of a bill into law.
Yeah, and in this case, the governor has signed legislation that decriminalizes the possession of less than an ounce of marijuana from a misdemeanor to an infraction. Now, a lot of you are wondering, well, wasn't this already the case in California? No, actually it wasn't. Up until the governor did sign this legislation, it was still a misdemeanor to possess any amount of marijuana in the state of California. But since they mention it in here, I think it was since the 1970s, 1975, the state decriminalized minor marijuana possession. So it was still a misdemeanor, but they imposed a fine of $100 like it was just a traffic ticket or a parking ticket, just an infraction. But you still had to go to court. It was still processed through the judicial system like any other misdemeanor crime. Now there's not going to be the hearing and everything like that, I guess, unless you want to contest it, much like with a traffic ticket or a parking ticket, which does make a difference because the court system in California is very congested. I think California might be, I don't know if they're the most bankrupt state in the U.S. I think they are leading the pack as far as states that are running deficits. And a congested court system is just one more thing that contributes to that. So
right, and now the courts can hopefully focus on the real criminals out there that are actually hurting people. But the biggest part of this, Nick, the biggest part of this news is it takes away the record. So someone who experiments with marijuana at a younger age isn't going to be haunted as they go throughout life by this record, not able to get a job, not able to move on with their life because they did what over 100 million other Americans have done sometime in their life, tried marijuana, but they got busted for it. And
I think 100 million is a conservative estimate, actually.
Well, it's more than half of Americans admit to it at some point in their lives. So some of them
300, so it's 150 million now, well, at least minimum.
There we go.
But the other interesting thing
But the point is they won't have that record, which is great news.
And the other interesting thing to point out is that while the governor opposes it, there is going to be a ballot measure appearing on the ballot in California this year, Proposition 19, where the voters will be given the choice to vote for decriminalizing recreational use of marijuana. Basically,
legalizing.
Completely legalizing, basically treating marijuana like you do alcohol. So California adults over the age of 21 would be able to possess it for their own use, would be able to cultivate it on their own property, small amounts. I mean, there are limits within the law, but it would basically be moving marijuana regulation into line with alcohol regulation.
It's going to be there eventually,
yeah,
Nick. It may take 50 years before it's over the nation, but it will be. In California, within 5 to 10 years, definitely. Maybe later this year, but within 5 to 10 years in California, definitely. Nationwide, I mean, I know that my dad said this too when he was my age, but probably within 50 years, I think nationwide. And that's very conservative. I think it's going to be way beyond that.
Marijuana policy is changing more and more rapidly, and in a less restrictive direction.
I think that there will still be some holdout states like Utah and some of those other
I think it's
real conservative states.
I think it's still going to be a long time before you see the leap made to making it a completely legal product that's regulated like tobacco or alcohol is. I think that eventually will happen. Of course,
well,
by
once
then tobacco
states like
might
California
be illegal,
do it, Nick. So California does it, and suddenly the sky doesn't fall down. Because that's the whole deal right now. The reason we can't legalize marijuana is, well, the sky will fall, society will crumble. How will people cope? How will society stay together? And if one state does it and they go, oh, it didn't make any difference at all. In fact, drug use is down.
Well, that's the funny thing about it. As hard as we debate this, I mean, largely I think what we both expect would happen if you do see legalization is maybe some small decrease in usage, but not much change. I mean, it really doesn't make much difference to people whether a substance is legal or illegal. Now, by decriminalizing it or legalizing it, you're doing away with a lot of the harm that results from having a black market in the product, things like violence between drug dealers and drug gangs, which are most of the gangs in the country, and a lot of the other problems you see associated with prohibited products like adulteration with other drugs, things like that. So there are a lot of negative consequences.
Not to mention the cartels and stuff that are running it in, all the cartels out there. But I mean, I think it'll be a lot of positive effects. I think that now if it's in the legal market, the same guy who's selling a black market pot isn't also going to be selling crack cocaine or something, so at least those guys aren't going to be associated with each other as much. So I think there can be definitely some positives, but for the most part, like you said, Nick, I don't see much of a difference, and I think that's what we'll see in California. When they do it, they'll probably be the first state. They led the pack with medical marijuana, and I think it's looking like they're going to be doing that with the legalized version as well. I do like, though, I mean, although Arnold Schwarzenegger does oppose the legalization, at least he isn't as much of a hypocrite to veto this bill. I mean, he's on video smoking pot when he was younger, so what is it? In Pumping Iron. He smoked pot. It's a victory round after his muscle building. So good for him. Anyways, we'll report on that as California moves along and other states as well with what happens in November. But I did want to report on that good news. Unlike our wuss governor here, Mr. Lynch, who vetoed medical marijuana that would have only been for sick and dying people. These Schwarzenegger's not that bad.
It was only for a very specific set of sick and
it would have
dying
been like
people in New Hampshire.
200 people who are on death's doorstep would have gotten a little bit of relief. But small man Lynch can't do it. He's too much of a wuss. You're small too, so I'm just large, I guess.
You're enormous, so we'll see.
I still like to pick on Lynch for his height. Anyways, we do need to move along on this. When we come back, we're going to be getting into more depressing bad news. We're going to be getting into more big government out of California and, well, just a waste of federal mandates when it comes to street signs. Anyways, we'll be back. Stay tuned. This is Free Minds TV.
Am I on? Am I on?
You're on.
Hey, do I talk now? Do I talk now? I'm Gardner Goldsmith, and
I think she's up by where they're doing the show.
you're watching Free Minds TV. Open your mind, baby. Tell others to do the same.
And welcome back to Free Minds TV. It's still Toby here with you.
And Nick.
I'd like to invite the viewers to log on to our website. freemindstv.com is the address. From there, you get all the archives of the show, the radio side, ways to contact us, the show content on the forums, ways to donate us money if you really like us, and so much more. freemindstv.com. All right. When we left, we were talking about good news. Now it's time to get into some of the bad news. I want to talk about federal mandates and wasting taxpayers' money on useless projects. This is coming out of New York City, where New York City has begun a federally mandated program that will replace all capital letter street signs with correct lowercase versions in a new font, according to the Post. The effort began earlier this year and should be completed in 2018, costing around $27.6 million. The new font is called Clearview, and it is designed for just that purpose, to make street signs clear to everybody. The changes of the signs should be easier to read, according to the federal government. And it's quoted by these federal officials saying, on the internet, writing in all caps means you're yelling, so we can't have our street signs that way. What if people get confused and think that the streets are yelling at them?
Is that an actual concern?
Well, yeah, this is the federal government. This is in their review. The reason they're doing this is because on the internet, this is a quote from them. On the internet, writing in all caps means you're shouting.
Weren't the street signs around before the internet? Because in the
you
world
don't
of
wanna
street
confuse
signs,
people.
writing in all caps
Nick,
means you're
this
just
is a
writing
new
on a
age.
street
You
sign.
can't assume people know that the street signs aren't yelling at them. What if people think that the streets are yelling at them and get upset and crash?
People are, well, I was going to say people are pretty dumb, but I think that mostly applies to the people writing reviews like this.
This is the federal government, folks. This is the federal government saying these things.
I wonder how long it took them to do this. I bet it took
How
a
many
team of like
millions
20
of dollars,
people,
yeah,
like
right.
a year. to
I
write
think
this
it's
up.
probably being commissioned by whoever created the font Clearview. I wonder how much money
They
kickback
drank
they're getting.
coffee for the first 364 days and played solitaire and Tetris.
Oh, God.
And then on day 365, well, they were
Now
on
let's pick a
vacation.
font.
They were on vacation for about 2 months out of that too. And then on the last day when they actually had to throw something together that read like a fifth grader's report on this.
Yeah,
they
I guess so.
actually talk about how it relates to communicating through internet forums and chat.
And that somehow applies
And
to street
that
signs.
applies to this?
The city replaces some 8,000 signs a year anyways, Nick. So the report says, who cares?
No
This
big
isn't much
deal.
more. It's only 4 times more. Only $21 more million that we're going to be wasting. Who cares? It's just a little bit of money. $21 million in this when everybody's scraping by, barely paying the rent, barely paying the mortgage. And who cares? A little bit more money. It's all for the good of who created this Clearview and the guys who wrote this report, the sign builders. Mr. Bloomberg was asked a question by the Daily News about this, which he replied, quote, "This is the most ridiculous question that I've been presented with in 9 years," and refused to answer the question. Really? Is it really that ridiculous? It seems like a good question. You're replacing the signs because you don't want people to think the streets are yelling at you. And it's a little bit easier to read according to the same people who said that. Their report. See, that's what makes me not believe their report. They also put in their report that they don't want streets to be yelling at you. So, craziness.
I just think it would look odd to have street signs.
I don't know. And that's what I said. That's the other thing.
What about,
this is in New York City they're doing this, Nick. And I was like, wait. What do most street signs look like? So I'm driving around. They're all in caps. Even the federal ones.
Even in other parts of the world, even in other countries, when they're in different...
everywhere.
They're
Are we going to replace every stop sign? How many... this is going to be billions of dollars.
Well,
meanwhile, the bridges are falling apart.
Many billions
Meanwhile, the bridges are falling apart. The roads have potholes everywhere. The infrastructure is crumbling. And we're worrying about the street signs. We reported earlier about one of the companies that's really doing well in this recession is the company who's creating those recession signs.
The American Recovery Act signs that you see on the highway.
Yeah, they're making millions of dollars just making those signs. These sign people, that's if you're into stocks, can you buy these stocks in street sign making? Is that a stock you can buy? Because if so, they're going to be this climate because it's federally mandated programs like this, Nick. Replace all the street signs because they look too angry for us. Not a nice font. We have to have a nicer font.
Well, who knows if this will be adopted in most places.
Well, it's federally mandated. Why are they going after New York City?
Is it mandated, though?
Yes, in New York City. I don't know why just in New York City. We'll have to see how this turns out for the rest of the country and what the federal government's going to do about their uppercase street signs because they're everywhere. I did notice that in the Putting America Back to Work, there was parts of it that were in the correct lowercase font, but not all of it. Some of it was in that mean, angry, yelling font, according to these government officials at least. So, waste of money. Wasting my time reporting on it, I guess, but it's still worth it.
Yeah, they probably won't do anything about it. They're just going to spend the money.
Yeah.
Hopefully they'll spend it out of like some bailout money, right? Because, well, I guess you still pay for that. But you pay for it less directly than if your city or town actually has
I just find it so funny that the mayor, Mr. Bloomberg, says it's the most ridiculous question he's been asked in 9 years. It seems...
As to why he's doing it.
Right. It seems like a good question.
No.
Maybe I'm just small-minded.
I think Mayor Bloomberg is probably coming from a very different world. And, a good way to dismiss an argument is just to pretend it's silly.
Ridiculous.
That's ridiculous.
Silly. It's silly. Of course we need to replace the street signs.
Because he had to know, if he knew it, he probably didn't know anything about it.
Did you see this?
Probably didn't know anything
yelling at us. Crap. We need to replace it. We need to rip it down. Stop the show, Rick. Rip it down. Take it down. We don't want people to think we're yelling at them. It would be ridiculous. All right.
He probably didn't know what the question was about, or he knew that he'd look ridiculous trying to defend it, so he just called the reporter ridiculous. Oh, this is not a bad strategy. Politicians are really good at that duck and direct thing. You just duck the question, redirect to another reporter.
I guess.
And just keep doing that until you find
I did need to point this out real quick. I did say that they replace 8,000 street signs a year anyway, so they say it's not a big deal to replace the other 250,000 plus signs. That's more than 4 times, or around 4 times. I don't know if it's more or less. Around 4 times more. Over $20 million more that they're spending on this. But they still say, who cares? It's just $20 million. All right, Nick. Equally ridiculous, Happy Meal toys and banning them.
Right.
Or is it more like holding them hostage?
It is like holding them hostage. It's not going to be an outright ban in San Francisco. But a proposed city ordinance would ban McDonald's from putting toys in Happy Meals unless it adds fruit and vegetable portions and limits calories. Are they just supposed to come up with a special menu for the city of San Francisco? Because last time I checked, a McDonald's was a McDonald's whether you were in Iowa or New Hampshire or California.
How can a city...
Are they going to just serve smaller ones for the city of San Francisco?
Wait, this is when, Nick, before we get into this story, this is when you know a government's grown too big when they say, stop your business, folks. You are not allowed to give away a free toy when you sell a hamburger. That is illegal. We are the government. We know better. You can serve the hamburger.
That's what we're talking about.
But no free toy. That's what we're talking about. I just want to break it down as simple as possible. The San Francisco government thinks that they know best to say that businesses, and this isn't just McDonald's, this goes for all businesses out there, have to have certain guidelines of what they're serving if they want to give away free toys.
And how critical are the toys in the Happy Meals? like, that's the other thing I'm looking at here is this is the government trying to lean on the business, but they're government and they're not doing a very, very good job. Like, they could just try to ban selling Happy Meals in San Francisco. Maybe they think it's more likely that McDonald's would appeal and perhaps win, saying that this city was overstepping its bounds. But maybe, what if McDonald's just says, okay, well, it's just San Francisco. Our business is all over the world. I doubt, I mean, you're dealing with probably a very small fraction of a percent of the profit that McDonald's makes as a corporation is out of the city of San Francisco. A very small percent of it is probably out of the state of California, which is a very big state. So what's their incentive here? What if McDonald's just says, well, it's better for our business just not to give out the toy?
I just want to see the police officer in that restaurant. That it doesn't matter if it's McDonald's or anyone else. I want to see the footage of the person giving the hamburger and then the toy, and then the guns come out. You can't give that Matchbox away or Barbie doll or whatever it is that this month's toy. You can't give away free toys to kids.
Yeah, and the city's defending this. I also wanted to point out that the city of San Francisco has done some pretty unhinged things here in the name of public health. The proposed Happy Meal law is just the latest in a string of San Francisco ordinances aimed at regulating public health. The city recently expanded a law banning tobacco sales in pharmacies to include grocery stores and big box stores that also have pharmacies. And I think we also reported on this. San Francisco also banned sweetened beverages like Coca-Cola and Pepsi from vending machines on city property.
You know, it's so funny. A smoker is a very addictive habit, Nick. A smoker is going to go, you know, I can't get my cigarettes in the pharmacy, so I'm going to quit. I don't know how to get them. I'm all done.
It's not like you can just go down to the corner store.
I'm going to have to walk across the street to get my cigarettes. I guess I won't smoke anymore. You know what? You know how you stop kids from being fat, Nick? It's a lot of it dates back to the parents. Stop feeding them crap and counting on the government
and maybe
to
stop
do
being.
everything.
In many cases, it's like set a better example because
that would be great.
Typically, if you're a really obese parent, the chances are better.
But you know what the government can do, since the government takes care of the schools from cradle till they're 20 or so.
Right. Now it's anywhere between 18 and 25.
Okay. So the government's taking care of these people with them most of the day. How about this? Instead of cutting back on recess and making fourth graders have 10 minutes of recess a day, give them a couple hours. They don't need to learn it. They'll learn that stuff eventually, Nick. You know, when I was in school, I had 2 hours of recess through 8th grade. It was excellent. And I did fine. I went to high school at almost a 4.0. No problems whatsoever. It'll be fine. What we need to do is stop trying to...
Well, some places have done away with recess entirely.
Yeah, in some places, I wouldn't be
surprised
surprised
if... unstructured time for children to play.
No, you can't make them run around. Some places have gotten to the point where they'll have recess, but you can't run or play tag because what if you trip and fall? You have to walk everywhere because running's too dangerous.
Supposedly that's what it's about. And at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, I think that at the higher levels where recommendations like that are made, structural changes to things like public education, which if you look into the history of public education, not necessarily in its present form, but how it was envisioned by the early advocates, it was really a way of indoctrinating society, indoctrinating young people and turning them into model citizens, basically.
Well, no matter what, education is indoctrination.
Got to do away with the recess.
All these people who say conspiracy, Nick,
a good worker so you're just smart enough to do the grunt work and operate a machine. Or
maybe fat enough not to even do anything.
But too stupid, too ill, not necessarily stupid, but too uneducated to actually question the way society is being molded to screw you.
Well, I work in schools, Nick, and my wife's a public school teacher. I'm not saying that all schools are trying to dumb kids down. I'm saying that they're giving these mandates to make it.
I don't think on the ground level. I don't think individual public school teachers,
anyways, Nick,
superintendents are trying to do
this is another debate for another day because we're out of time. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it, though. fmtv@freemindsmedia.org is the web address. Send us your email. That's the email address. freemindstv.com is the web address. Log on there. Content, archives, ways to help the show, everything else. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have a good one.